One of the games that my kids and I love to play is hide and go seek. Do you ever feel like that God is playing a game of hide and go seek with you? Well, that's one of the things that we're going to discuss on today's episode of Dealing with Deconstruction. I've invited a special guest on, and we're going to unpack where is God and is he hidden? I'm looking forward to the conversation. I hope you are too. Well, welcome to Dealing with Deconstruction. If you find that you ask yourself bigger than life questions, the really deep questions in life, so much so that you're thinking about abandoning your Christian faith, you don't know if you can hold on to your Christian faith, you are in the right place. I want to say that you are welcome here, and I'm so glad that you're checking out this video, and I'm excited about the topic that we have today. Before we get to that topic, I wanted to invite you to two things. One is, if that described you, if you're on this journey and you're asking these deep questions about the core beliefs that you have of Christianity, I would invite you to subscribe to this channel, as that is the main thing that we're discussing. The other thing that I want to invite you to is our Facebook community. In the Facebook community, we have dialogues, we have discussions. We're not trying to convince anybody of anything, but we know that when you're on the deconstruction path, that it can be lonely. And the Facebook group is just a way that we can connect with other people that are on that same journey and have discussions around topics that are relevant to you and to your journey. With that, I want to introduce our topic today, which is the Divine Hiddenness. Where is God? God is playing this hide and go seek game, it seems like, with us, where we don't necessarily know where he is at. That maybe that question has crossed your mind. Why isn't he made himself more evident? Why can't I have a Paul-like experience? And so in order to help me discuss that, I have invited on my friend Jonathan McLatchie. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tim. It's great to be here.
Well, Jonathan and I have been friends for a long time. Jonathan is a scholar. He has his doctorate degree, his PhD in a scientific field in biology, but he has done amazing work in several areas of the Christian faith, convincing people of the Christian faith, which we call apologetics, making a case. He's talked about the reliability of the Gospels, why we should trust those. He's done work in his specific field on the evidences for God that point to the evidence for God. He's done work in intelligent design. So he is well-versed in several areas, but we're going to talk about an article that he wrote, which is linked in the description, about divine hiddenness. So, Jonathan, as we kick this off, in your article, you quoted a scholar, a philosopher named John Schellenberg, and he has written a book called The Hiddenness Argument, Philosophy's New Challenge to Belief in God. So in order to kind of launch us into this conversation, I thought I would quote him in his book, which you also quoted in your article, because I think it's a great place to start. He says, this is like just a little bit of an analogy, kind of what he talks about. He says, I'd like to draw an analogy of a friend describing his parents. He said, wow, are they ever great? I wish everyone could have parents like mine, who are so wonderfully loving. Granted, they don't want anything to do with me. They've never been around. Sometimes I find myself looking for them. Once, I have to admit, I even called out for them when I was sick, but to no avail. Apparently, they aren't open to being in a relationship with me, at least not yet. But it's good that they love me as much as they do, and as beautifully as they do. This analogy should give us a sense of the impact of the emotional argument and the rhetoric that he uses with this argument. So, Jonathan, just give me your initial thoughts on that analogy as John Schellenberg lays it out.
Absolutely, and I think that's really illustrative of the emotional and rhetorical force of the argument from Divine Hiddenness. I think that it's certainly a difficult problem emotionally. Why does God not make his existence more immediately apparent or immediately obvious to us? Why does he require so much hard work and discipline to actually uncover the veracity of the gospel and his existence and so forth? So I certainly think that it's a difficult problem that we as Christians need to take seriously and we need to address thoughtfully.
Well, yeah, and so we're going to do that. We're going to try to hit all of those different questions and try to answer as many of them as we can. I just want to remind those that are watching, if you have any questions as Jonathan and I are talking, you can go ahead and leave those in the comments. We'll do our best to respond to those either in a future video or just underneath the in the comment in the reply. So one of the things, Jonathan, that I know that you've heard a lot is that people will echo something along this. This really isn't necessarily an argument, but it's a train of thought where people are saying, God knows what would convince me that he exists, or God knows what would convince me that Christianity is true. Like, as I'm on this deconstruction journey, I'm starting to doubt my belief in the resurrection. I'm starting to doubt my belief in the authority of the Bible. I'm starting to doubt my belief in God's existence altogether. But he hasn't given me or shown up in a way that would convince me. So either God doesn't want to be in a relationship with me, he's fine with me being on this deconstruction journey, he's fine with me doubting, or he doesn't know what would convince me. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think that God has provided what ought to be rationally sufficient reasons for believing that he exists. I believe that when you look at the world around us, when we look at the created order, we are struck by the evidence all around us of design in the world, and that evidence is immediately apparent. It's pressed against our noses every time we walk outside, and there's a rigorous and explicit way of expressing and articulating the argument from natural theology for the existence of God. And you can make I've done in my own works rigorous arguments that there's a mind behind the existence of biological systems, and the fine tuning of the laws and constants of physics and so forth. But you don't have to even rest on the discoveries of modern science in order to have rational confidence that yes, there's a God who made the world, who rationally ordered it. Sometimes an objection that will come up is, why does God make it so difficult to uncover his existence? And why doesn't it make it so obvious, or put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as it were? Why do we need to go and acquire PhDs in astrophysics and molecular biology to discover that God exists? But I actually think it's a lot easier than people realize. That it's not that it's complicated per se, it's that it's been made artificially complicated by bad scholarship, which insists that the simplest explanation can actually be the actual explanation. Richard Dawkins says that Charles Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. In other words, before the dawn of Darwinism in 1859, it was apparent from the natural world that yes, these living systems that we observe all around us bear the hallmarks, the unmistakable hallmarks of intelligent causality.
Right.
And therefore, it's that evidence is really literally pressed up against our noses. When you, even before the scientific revolution, you just look at things like metamorphosis or embryology, going from a fertilized egg to an adult form capable of reproduction and so forth. These are systems which we recognize as requiring foresight to bring about. And so if there's so much evidence all around us of design in the natural world, then that should compel us at least to take the next step and investigate, well, could there be truth to the Christian religion? And we can discover that, I think, by looking at the biblical text. And I think that God has provided sufficient reason that anyone who takes the time to make oneself fully informed will, in the long run, if one is attempting to be as objective as possible with the evidence, will in the long run come to find Christianity to be true and well supported.
Well, yeah.
So,
yeah, yeah. No, well, I was going to say, you've drawn an analogy in your article between God's existence and gravity, and people might often say, well, why can't God make his existence as apparent as gravity? So I want you to flush that out for us just a little bit.
Sure. So sometimes people will say, well, why can't God's existence be as apparent, immediately obvious as gravity? Well, gravity is not obvious. It wasn't discovered until Isaac Newton came along and uncovered it. In fact, the ancient Greeks thought that everything gravitated towards the center of the earth. So gravity is not something which is immediately obvious. And by the way, just because something's not obvious doesn't mean it's not well evidentially supported. For example, one analogy I gave in my article is that of a chair, a physical object.
Yeah, this is interesting.
And the physical object, like a chair, is composed of mostly empty space because of the structure of the atom. But that's not something that's obvious. In fact, it seems to be obviously not the case that the chair is mostly empty space. But nonetheless, we know from scientific data that it is mostly empty space. And so just because something's not immediately obvious doesn't mean that it's not is not true. And furthermore, coming back to your question about God knowing how much it would take to convince me, so therefore why has he not given sufficient evidence? Well, when we go to the biblical text, we actually see plenty of examples where God gave overwhelming evidence right in people's faces and they still didn't believe. So for instance, you've got the Israelites in the wilderness who've seen so many miracles. They've passed through the Red Sea. God's given them the manna and so forth, so many miracles, and yet they rebelled against God. We see in the New Testament, Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus. And what do the Jewish authorities want to do? They want to put Lazarus to death again, and they also want to kill Jesus. Right. We see another example in John 20, even with Thomas, and this is a common text that's cited, or I think misused by fideists to support fideism. So Thomas is asked, Thomas asks to see the prints of the nails in Jesus' hands and feet, and the spear, the wound that from his side from the spear, and unless he see these things, he says that he will not believe. And Jesus, of course, famously tells him in verse 29. Blessed are you because you have seen and believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. But what's going on there, I think, is that Jesus is chiding Thomas for having rejected the sufficient evidence. The sufficient evidence was the testimony of the other apostles. But no, he wasn't content with evidence that was rationally sufficient, that ought to provide a rational basis for believing that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, namely the testimony of his friends who claimed that they'd witnessed him. In that very multi-sensory way. But he wanted more than that. And I think if God has provided us with rationally sufficient justification for believing the gospel to be true, then it's very difficult, I think, to impugn God's goodness for not having given us even more evidence. Because the problem with divine hiddenness, I think, is often an excuse to not have to deal with the evidence, because when you present the evidence and they say, well, why couldn't God have just given us more evidence? I mean, right. How much evidence would be sufficient? I mean, it seems to me that if the more evidence we have, the less surprising it is that God hasn't given us more evidence. So where do we draw the line there? How much evidence is sufficient? In fact, if you look at people like Richard Dawkins or Peter Boghossian, when they are asked, how much evidence would it take to convince you that Christianity is true? They will say things like, not even the second coming would convince me. Yeah. In fact, Peter Atkins, whom I debated last January, year past in January, I asked him what could convince him that God exists, and he said nothing could convince him. Right. So, and one other point I'll make here is that, yes, God knows how much evidence it would take to convince me, but he also knows how how we're going to respond given more evidence, right? And if God, I think it's plausible that God could decide to withhold from us more evidence because that would make us more morally culpable, and therefore that would put us in danger of greater judgment because God knows exactly how we're going to respond. So it's not necessarily clear that God necessarily morally ought to give us more evidence, given that he knows how we'll respond to it and knows what the consequences of that would be, that we bring upon ourselves a greater damnation.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. Jonathan, man, I love your mind. I love the way that you're able to articulate things, and I always enjoy talking to you. I want to bring up kind of a subject that I think a number of people may have experienced in their life where they grew up maybe in a Christian home. At some point, they may have gone to some sort of concert, or they went to a youth group event. For me, there was this event called Footsteps, which are really, really, really impactful. It was a weekend of my peers worshiping God, experiencing God. And I know a lot of people gave their life to Christ kind of in that moment. But then, and they may have said coming out of that they were sure that God was real and that Jesus changed their life. But years down the road, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, they're no longer a Christian. They're saying, man, that was it. And they've explained that experience away as just an emotional reaction to the environment, not necessarily Jesus. How would you respond to someone that has kind of lost their faith when that was part of their story, when it comes to something like the evidence for God's existence or the evidence for the resurrection?
So what you mean? Sorry, can you say that the first part of the question again?
Yeah, I'm looking for what sort of advice or what sort of journey would you send somebody on that had that intense emotional experience, believed in the moment that it was God, but then later abandoned their faith, saying, well, it probably wasn't God?
Yeah. So one point that John Steingard makes is that when he went to a Coldplay concert, he had the same emotional experience that he did from Christian worship music, and therefore, obviously, the experience that he was getting during his worship music was not produced by God, because he was getting it over here in response to a Coldplay concert. And my response to that is that that God has designed us to be emotionally moved by music, and to be emotionally stirred and emotionally turned on, and just because that has a natural explanation that God has hardwired that reaction into us through natural processes, that doesn't, I think, take away from the fact that God has designed us to be emotionally moved by music, so that we can enjoy that part of worshiping God, if that makes sense.
No, you're exactly right. And that's one of the things I would just echo, that as a musician, I have been to several concerts, whether I've been on stage or I've been in the audience or I've been working them, and I've felt something similar and been able to point to this intense feeling of God as reality, whether that was a Christian band on stage or whether that was somebody else. And so I would completely echo that point. I do want to harken back to something you said in our last segment, and bring kind of a pop culture reference to that. I heard this recently, that if you look at Indiana Jones, if you look at the Indiana Jones movies, right, each movie has an element of something that is, let's just say, supernatural. Maybe it's not Christian, maybe it's not theist, but it's supernatural. And every single movie, at the beginning of the next movie, we find that Dr. Jones remains super skeptical. And so I think that there's a parallel between that and the stories that you were telling in the Bible, where people have experienced Jesus, either miracles, they were one of the people that have been fed, they saw Lazarus walk out of the grave, they saw the blind man running down the street, who they had just seen the day before, begging, and that wasn't enough to convince them. So Jonathan, how would you respond to somebody that is in that position where they're saying, man, I want to see somebody healed, and that would convince me?
Yeah, so on that, I would say, well, what about testimonial evidence of miraculous occurrences happening in the world today? If your own testimony would be sufficient to convince you, then doesn't the testimony of other people carry some weight with it? In fact, in my article, I cite Craig Keener, who wrote a 2-volume set on the topic of miracles. And he discusses a friend of his called Leo Bawa. And this friend of his is the former director of research at KPRO, which is a prominent Nigerian missions movement. And one intriguing miracle of several that he told Dr. Keener about is that among some tribes in, so I'm quoting here from the book, is that among some tribes in Adamawa and Taraba State, I had instances where no interpreter was available, and the Lord gave me understanding and ability to speak the people's languages, a feat I never performed before or since after that incident, end quote. And so Keener also notes that, quote, other accounts of this phenomenon exist, although many of these are secondhand, end quote. And then in a footnote, Dr. Keener elaborates that, quote, I have direct accounts in which others recognize the languages from Dr. Derek Morphew and Pastor David Workman, and he lists several others. And he notes his one of his students regarding her Jewish mother becoming a believer in Jesus because she understood the Hebrew prayer of an uneducated pastor's prayer in tongues. He also notes David Del Tar from personal correspondence, noting 3 cases he has witnessed, including a recent one involving Korean. So he gives other examples as well. Now, and in fact, I've heard about that sort of phenomenon from others as well.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be the type of thing that could be explained naturalistically. And I trust Dr. Keener. I think that he's a trustworthy scholar. And I think that he's all the evidence I have on Dr. Keener suggests that he is sincere. I don't think that he's going to be lying about such things. And I presume that he also trusts his sources, since these are personal contacts of his. In fact, the fact that the phenomenon is multiply attested also is of value. And so it seems unlikely in these cases that Keener's sources are all lying to him. And these also seem to be phenomena about which it would be quite hard to be honestly wrong.
Yeah.
So that points to miraculous occurrences in the world taking place today. Now, that's not the only type of miraculous event that's taking place in the world today, but I choose that particular example because that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about, and I think that testimonial evidence is a valid form of evidence, especially when someone is a public scholar and you can dig into their work and see how meticulous is the scholar, how generally reliable and trustworthy are they, and so then and is this someone that's likely to be making stuff up? And if you, to the extent to which you can reduce the probability that they lied, and you can reduce the probability that they're honestly mistaken, that increases in turn the probability that yes, this is an actual genuine occurrence. So I'd highly recommend that 2-volume set on miracles, where he documents other testimonial claims concerning miraculous events, and therefore that is sufficient reason, I think, to believe that miracles are taking place in the world today. And that, by the way, also undermines Hume's skepticism of miracles, because one of David Hume's objections to establishing a miraculous event is that it goes against the uniform repeated experience of mankind. Right. But in order to make that argument, he has to dismiss all that testimonial evidence. And so he's presupposing the very conclusion he's hoping to establish. And so it's a classic textbook example of circular reasoning.
Okay. That was fantastic. I do want you to respond to this idea, because we're talking about miracles, we're talking about testimonial claims. What would you say to the person, just very clearly, very succinctly, to the person that's like, God would not need apologists to make any sort of case for his existence if he actually existed?
So I don't see why God wouldn't need God doesn't need apologists. He chooses to use apologists. So I don't see why, if on the supposition of theism, there would be no apologists, people that are making the case for his existence. In fact, in the early church, you see apologists. Paul was an apologist. Apollos was an apologist. Even Jesus was an apologist, right? So John the Baptist approaches Jesus and says, "Hey, are you the one that we're expecting, or should we be waiting for another?" And what does Jesus say to John? Just go back and say to John, does he say, "Well, actually, John, you just have to have blind faith"? No, he says, "Well, go back to John, tell him what you see and hear, right? The deaf receive their sight, the lame walk, the blind see, and so forth. The lepers are cleansed," which is actually quoting from Isaiah 35, which concern the signs you expect to see when Yahweh shows up to save his people. So Yeah, does that answer your question?
No, it totally does. And I think, again, creating all of those different types of connections biblically, you don't necessarily need a PhD in ancient languages to be able to do that. It can happen just through reading and studying the scriptures just at a lay level. And so that's one of the things that I think is exciting is that we can know the God that saves. We can know the God that walked out of the grave. I do want to talk a little bit about, because we've used this word a number of times, and I know that you have a very well-informed and unique perspective on this particular word. I want you to kind of define or talk a little bit about evidence for me, because I think that that gets a little bit murky. We've used the word a number of times when someone's saying, I want evidence that Christianity is true, or I want evidence that God exists. They're thinking about some of those things, and that's why we have this whole problem of divine hiddenness or this hide and seek game, is because what they're thinking of evidence or what they're looking for as evidence may not necessarily be what I'm defining as evidence or what you're defining as evidence. So just give us kind of a broad understanding of evidence as you see it.
Sure. So I'm a Bayesian, and before your listeners freak out, let me explain what I mean by evidence as a Bayesian. So for a Bayesian, evidence is defined in terms of a likelihood ratio, which measures attempts to quantify the strength of a particular piece of evidence. So the likelihood ratio is the probability of that particular evidence given your hypothesis on the numerator, and the probability of that same evidence given the falsehood of the hypothesis, and that would be the denominator. So to the extent that that likelihood ratio is top heavy, that is how strong your evidence is. So for example, if you have a likelihood ratio of 5-to-1, which is known as a Bayes factor of 5, then that means that your evidence is 5 times more likely if your hypothesis is true than if it were false. And if you have two pieces of evidence of the same evidential value, then that would be 5 times 5. So the cumulative power of these two evidences taken together would be 25. And so forth.
So maybe you could give us like an example from the New Testament. So if I'm understanding you correct, and please correct me where I'm not getting this right, bless you. So something like the stories of a resurrected Jesus, right? So we have clear indication from just reading it historically, not reading it as a divine document, historically that Jesus lived and that he was crucified. But then we do have some testimony, some writings from as close as we can get to the actual event that people witnessed Jesus afterwards. So are you saying that the likelihood of those existing afterwards raises the probability of Jesus actually walking out of the grave, or are you saying something else? How would you evaluate some of those?
No, absolutely. The probability of the apostolic testimony to have encountered the risen Jesus alive from the dead is more probable given the resurrection hypothesis than given the falsehood of the resurrection hypothesis, which in turn raises the probability of the resurrection hypothesis actually being true. And I think that's especially the case when we consider the nature of the claimed resurrection encounters with Jesus. In fact, I would argue, and I think one can argue very robustly and in a compelling way, that the Gospels and Acts are based on substantially reliable eyewitness testimony. That is, they're written by authors who are close up to the facts, they're well informed, and they're habitually reliable. And I think there's a very fantastically powerful cumulative argument to be made for that. That being the case, then if that is the case, then we have to take seriously what those documents say concerning the nature and variety of the post-resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus, including its multi-sensory or polymodal character involving not just sight, but group sightings, physical contact with Jesus,
Right.
Group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And according to Acts 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period. So it wasn't just a brief and confusing episode. And so that sort of experience is something which is very difficult to be honestly mistaken about, and so it reduces, I think, quite significantly the plausibility that the apostles were honest and mistaken. And then we can look at the circumstances of the testimonial claims made in the Gospels. For the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Christian Church, including in the first century, the Christian movement was persecuted by the Roman Empire, albeit in waves, but certainly the apostles uncontestably endured labors and dangers and toils and hardships as a result of their testimony that Christ has been raised from the dead. And so their willingness to suffer persecution and hardships is significantly more probable given the hypothesis of sincerity than the falsehood of that. And that's just the peak of the iceberg. But as you reduce the probability of the hypothesis that they were honestly mistaken and the hypothesis that they were deliberately deceiving people, you redistribute the probabilities, because when anyone makes a testimonial claim, there are 3 and only 3 categories of explanation which could purport to explain that claim. One is that they lied about it. One is that they're honestly mistaken. One is that they're true. That what they're saying is true. Yeah. And so as you reduce the probabilities of the first and second hypothesis, you redistribute the probabilities such that the third hypothesis increases in probability. So that's my approach to making the case for the resurrection.
Well, that's excellent. And as anybody that's watching can tell, Jonathan has this great ability to be able to understand things scientifically. He applies the way that he thinks about things to the Bible, to historical evidence. And I have loved his heart and his passion for defending the Christian faith and for elucidating God where we may think that he is not. It is clear that from the article, again, that's linked in the description, and I hope from this discussion today that that God is not hidden, that he is clear, that we are able to look at the evidence, that we're able to understand the evidence, that it is apparent to us that God is here and that he is seeking a relationship with us. And so we hearken back to that first quote from John Schellenberg, that our parents are not distant, that God is there, that God is entering into suffering, and that God is helping us through each and every step and each and every day. Jonathan, any final closing thoughts before we wrap up today?
I would just encourage people that are deconstructing or thinking about deconstructing to really explore the public evidences of the gospel. I have a website where I've written articles on the public evidences for Christianity and the resurrection in particular, as well as other evidences, prophecy, and so forth. And you can find my Hiddenness article there also, as well as my treatment of arguments like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and how that factors into making the case for miracles and the resurrection and so forth. So you can find that at jonathanmclatchie.com. And furthermore, if you are if you are a Christian and you are wrestling with doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith, I also run a free doubting service on my website. So you can go onto my website and fill out a form there, which contacts me, and you can basically let me know about the doubts that you're struggling with, and we can set up a time to talk about it on Zoom one-on-one. So please take advantage of that if you are struggling with doubts.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the description straight to that form. Take advantage of that. Anybody that is doubting or has questions, I hope Jonathan has demonstrated that he is a caring and intelligent person, that he has worked through some of these questions at a level that most people have not. And the fact that he's making himself available to be able to have conversations with anybody that's doubting is something that everybody should take advantage of. So I'll go ahead and leave that link in the description. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today in our Dealing with Doubt show.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Well, I hope that what Jonathan said was able to resonate with you. I hope you're able to put one more board back in your deconstruction process in order to build back your Christian faith in a new way. And I do want to remind you of our Facebook group that we have that is surrounding Dealing with Deconstruction. As we have mentioned in the beginning, it can be a lonely place if you're doubting. Take advantage of that conversation with Jonathan that he's made available for you. And I just want to end this episode the way that I end every episode, with a quote from my good friend Bobby Conway, where he invites you to doubt toward faith. Doubters, we'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.